Question 1. Which approach would be most appropriate for a process server encountering a hostile individual who is verbally aggressive and physically blocking the entrance to the premises where service is to be effected? Option A. Attempt to de-escalate the situation through calm communication, and if necessary, retreat and contact law enforcement for assistance. Option B. Engage in a verbal argument with the individual to assert the right to serve the documents. Option C. Abandon the service attempt entirely and leave the premises without any further action or documentation. Option D. Immediately force entry into the premises to complete the service before the situation deteriorates further. The correct answer is A. Attempt to de-escalate the situation through calm communication, and if necessary, retreat and contact law enforcement for assistance. Explanation. This scenario presents a professionally challenging situation due to the inherent unpredictability and potential for escalation when attempting service in a hostile environment. The process server's safety, the integrity of the service, and adherence to legal and ethical standards are all at risk. Careful judgment is required to balance the duty to serve with the paramount need for personal security and lawful conduct. The correct approach involves prioritizing de-escalation and seeking assistance when faced with overt hostility. This strategy acknowledges the limitations of a process server's authority and the potential for physical harm. It aligns with the ethical obligation to act responsibly and avoid unnecessary confrontation, which could jeopardize the service or lead to legal repercussions for the server. Regulatory frameworks often implicitly or explicitly support the avoidance of dangerous situations and the use of appropriate resources when faced with threats. This approach ensures that the service attempt, even if temporarily halted, is conducted in a manner that is both safe and legally defensible, and that the situation is managed by those equipped to handle it. An incorrect approach that involves attempting to force entry or physically overcome resistance is professionally unacceptable. This action directly violates the principle of lawful service, as it could constitute trespass or assault, depending on the jurisdiction's specific statutes. Such an approach disregards the process server's limited authority, which does not extend to breaking and entering or using force beyond what is reasonably necessary for self-defense. Ethically, it demonstrates a reckless disregard for the safety of all parties involved and a failure to uphold the integrity of the legal process by resorting to unlawful means. Another incorrect approach, that of immediately abandoning the service without any attempt at de-escalation or assessment, while prioritizing safety, may not fully meet the professional obligation to attempt service. Safety is paramount. A complete abandonment without any attempt to understand the situation or seek appropriate support might be seen as a failure to exercise due diligence, depending on the specific circumstances and the nature of the hostility. A more nuanced approach that attempts to assess and de-escalate before considering withdrawal is generally preferred. A further incorrect approach, that of engaging in verbal altercations or attempting to reason with an irate individual in a highly charged emotional state, can exacerbate the hostility. While communication is often key, engaging in a debate or argument when emotions are running high is unlikely to be productive and significantly increases the risk of escalation. This can lead to a breakdown in communication, further endanger the server, and potentially compromise the integrity of any subsequent service attempt. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a rapid assessment of the environment and the nature of the hostility. This includes evaluating the immediate threat to personal safety. If a threat is perceived, the primary response should be to disengage and retreat to a safe distance. Following this, the server should assess whether the situation can be safely resolved through de-escalation techniques, or if law enforcement or other appropriate authorities need to be contacted. Documenting the encounter thoroughly, including the reasons for withdrawal or the involvement of authorities, is crucial for legal and professional accountability. The ultimate goal is to achieve lawful service while upholding personal safety and adhering to all applicable regulations and ethical guidelines. Question 2. The analysis reveals that a process server has been tasked with serving a summons and complaint on a defendant residing in State B, where the lawsuit was filed in a state of court. The process server is familiar with the general principles of due process and service of process, but has not recently reviewed the specific rules for either State A or State B. The defendant is not readily available for personal service at their residence. Which of the following actions best demonstrates adherence to state court systems and their procedures for this scenario? Option A. proceeding with service by mail to the defendant's last known address, assuming this is a universally accepted method for substituted service when personal service is difficult. Option B. Contacting the plaintiff's attorney to request clarification on the specific rules for service in both State A and State B, and to inquire about any court-ordered alternative service methods. Option C. Attempting to serve the defendant's adult roommate at their residence, as this is a common method of substituted service in many jurisdictions. Option D. Serving the defendant's employer at their place of business, believing that this will provide sufficient notice to the defendant. The correct answer is C. Attempting to serve the defendant's adult roommate at their residence, as this is a common method of substituted service in many jurisdictions. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a process server to navigate the nuances of state court jurisdiction and service of process rules, which can vary significantly. A process server must not only understand the general principles of due process, but also the specific procedural requirements of the state in which the action is filed and where service is to be made. Misinterpreting these requirements can lead to defective service, which can result in dismissal of the case, wasted time and resources, and potential liability for the server. The correct approach involves meticulously verifying the specific jurisdictional requirements of the state court where the lawsuit was filed and cross-referencing these with the rules governing service of process in the state where the defendant resides or can be found. This includes understanding the types of documents that constitute valid service, the permissible methods of service, e.g., personal service, substituted service, service by mail, and any residency or domicile requirements for substituted service. Adhering strictly to these state-specific rules ensures that service is legally valid and upholds the defendant's right to due process, thereby protecting the integrity of the legal proceedings. An incorrect approach that relies solely on general knowledge of process serving without consulting the specific state's rules risks failing to meet the statutory requirements for valid service. For instance, attempting substituted service by leaving documents with a roommate in a state that requires service on a family member of suitable age and discretion residing in the defendant's home, or failing to comply with specific mailing requirements for service by mail, would constitute a regulatory failure. Another incorrect approach would be to assume that service methods permissible in one state are automatically valid in another, leading to a violation of the procedural due process rights of the defendant and potentially rendering the service void. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes thorough research and adherence to specific jurisdictional rules. This involves 1. Identifying the governing jurisdiction for the lawsuit and the location of the defendant. 2. Consulting the relevant state statutes and court rules for both jurisdictions concerning service of process. 3. Selecting the method of service that is both legally permissible and most likely to ensure actual notice to the defendant. 4. Documenting all steps taken meticulously to create a clear record of compliance. Question 3. Benchmark analysis indicates that a process server, certified in the state of exam jurisdiction, is tasked with serving a summons and complaint on a defendant residing in the state of another state. The lawsuit was filed in the state of exam jurisdiction. The process server is familiar with the rules of civil procedure for the state of exam jurisdiction, but has limited knowledge of the rules in the state of another state. What is the most appropriate course of action to ensure valid service of process? Option A. Attempt to personally hand the documents to the defendant at their residence, assuming this will be universally accepted as valid service. Option B. Decline to serve the defendant until the process server can obtain specific legal advice from an attorney in the state of another state. Option C. Consult and strictly adhere to the rules of civil procedure of the state of another state for the manner of service, as this is where the defendant is located and service is being performed. Option D. Serve the defendant strictly in accordance with the rules of civil procedure of the state of exam jurisdiction, as this is where the lawsuit was filed. The correct answer is D. Serve the defendant strictly in accordance with the rules of civil procedure of the state of exam jurisdiction, as this is where the lawsuit was filed. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge because a process server must navigate potentially conflicting procedural rules when serving a defendant in a state different from where the lawsuit was filed. The server's primary duty is to ensure valid service of process, which is fundamental to due process and the court's jurisdiction. Failure to adhere to the correct rules can lead to the dismissal of the case wasted resources, and potential liability for the server. The server must exercise careful judgment to determine which state's rules govern the service. The correct approach involves recognizing that when service is made in a state other than the issuing court state, the rules of the state where service is being made generally govern the manner of service, provided those rules are constitutionally sufficient. This is often codified in state rules of civil procedure, such as Rule 4E of the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure, if this were a federal case, which is a common framework for state-level exams to draw from conceptually or analogous state rules. The server must consult and apply the rules of the forum state, where the defendant is located and service is being performed, to ensure the service is legally effective in that state, and therefore valid in the originating state. This ensures due process is met for the defendant. An incorrect approach would be to solely rely on the rules of the state where the lawsuit was filed. While the originating state's court issues the summons, it cannot dictate the manner of service in another sovereign state. Attempting to serve according to the originating state's rules when those methods are not permitted or are insufficient under the laws of the state where service is attempted would likely result in invalid service. This fails to provide adequate notice to the defendant as required by the laws of the state where they reside or can be found. Another incorrect approach would be to assume that any method of delivery that physically places the documents in the defendant's hands is sufficient, without regard to specific procedural requirements. This overlooks the detailed requirements for valid service, which often include specific methods of delivery, e.g., to a resident of suitable age and discretion at the dwelling house, or to an authorized agent, the need for a summons to be properly issued and endorsed, and the filing of proof of service. Such a casual approach disregards the legal framework designed to ensure fairness and proper notification. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to refuse to serve because the server is unfamiliar with the rules of the other state. While caution is warranted, the professional responsibility of a certified process server includes understanding and applying the relevant rules of civil procedure for the jurisdictions in which they operate. If unfamiliar, the server should seek clarification or consult the applicable rules rather than abandoning their duty. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve 1. Identifying the originating jurisdiction where the case is filed and the service jurisdiction where the defendant is located. 2. Consulting the rules of civil procedure for the service jurisdiction to determine the permissible methods of service. 3. Verifying that these methods meet constitutional due process standards. 4. Executing service strictly in accordance with the rules of the service jurisdiction. 5. Preparing and filing proof of service that accurately reflects the method used, complying with the requirements of the originating court. Question 4. The risk matrix shows a high probability of legal challenges arising from improper service of process in a multi-state litigation. A process server is asked to serve documents in State X, where they have previously served documents without issue. However, they have not recently reviewed the specific statutory requirements for process servers in State X. The process server is confident they meet general industry standards for professionalism and experience. What is the most appropriate course of action? Option A. Proceed with service, as their prior experience in State X and general professionalism should suffice. Option B. Immediately verify the current, specific statutory qualifications and licensing requirements for process servers in State X before proceeding. Option C. Assume that the general industry standards they adhere to are sufficient, as state laws are unlikely to have changed significantly. Option D. Contact the client to inform them of the potential risk, and ask if they are willing to accept service, even if there's a slight chance of a procedural challenge. The correct answer is A. Proceed with service, as their prior experience in State X and general professionalism should suffice. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the critical nature of adhering to state-specific process server qualifications and licensing requirements. Failure to comply can lead to the invalidation of service, significant legal repercussions for clients, and damage to the process server's reputation and livelihood. The core of the challenge lies in accurately identifying and applying the correct jurisdictional rules, which can vary significantly from one state to another. The correct approach involves a thorough understanding and strict adherence to the specific state laws governing process server qualifications and licensing in the jurisdiction where service is to be performed. This means verifying that the process server meets all statutory requirements, such as age, residency, background checks, and any mandatory training or examination. Furthermore, it necessitates ensuring that the process server holds a valid, current license or registration if such is mandated by the state. This approach is correct because it directly aligns with the legal framework designed to ensure the integrity and reliability of the judicial process. Compliance with these regulations is not merely procedural, it is fundamental to due process and the lawful execution of legal documents. An incorrect approach would be to assume that process-serving qualifications are uniform across all states or to rely on outdated information. This failure to verify current, state-specific licensing and qualification requirements is a direct violation of the regulatory framework. It demonstrates a lack of due diligence and professional responsibility, potentially leading to service being deemed improper and void. Another incorrect approach would be to proceed with service if the process server knows they do not meet a specific state's qualification or licensing mandate, such as lacking the required certification or having an expired license. This constitutes a deliberate disregard for the law, exposing the process server and their clients to significant legal jeopardy. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes legal compliance and ethical conduct. This involves proactively researching and understanding the process server qualification and licensing laws for every jurisdiction in which they intend to operate. Before accepting any assignment, a process server must confirm their own compliance with all applicable state statutes and regulations. If there is any doubt, or if a specific requirement is not met, the professional course of action is to decline the assignment or to seek clarification from legal counsel or the relevant state licensing authority. Continuous professional development and staying abreast of legislative changes are also crucial components of this framework. Question 5. Stakeholder feedback indicates that process servers sometimes encounter challenges when serving legal documents on diverse entities. Considering the advanced process server certification, exams focus on regulatory compliance. Which of the following approaches demonstrates the most legally sound and procedurally correct method for serving a large, publicly traded corporation, a general partnership, and a state government agency, respectively, within the United States? Option A. Serve the registered agent for the corporation, a designated agent for the partnership, and the specific department head responsible for the matter for the state agency. Option B. Serve the chief executive officer of the corporation, a managing partner for the partnership, and the secretary of state for the state agency. Option C. Serve any employee at the corporation's main office, any partner for the partnership, and the attorney general's office for the state agency. Option D. Serve the registered agent for the corporation, a general partner for the partnership, and the governor's office for the state agency. The correct answer is D. Serve the registered agent for the corporation, a general partner for the partnership, and the governor's office for the state agency. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because serving legal documents on entities requires strict adherence to specific statutory rules that vary significantly depending on the entity type and the governing jurisdiction. Misinterpreting these rules can lead to improper service, rendering the legal action voidable and potentially exposing the process server to liability. Careful judgment is required to identify the correct statutory method for each entity type to ensure due process is met. The correct approach involves identifying the specific statutory provisions governing service on corporations, partnerships, and government agencies within the relevant jurisdiction. For corporations, this typically means serving an officer, director, or registered agent. For partnerships, it often involves serving a general partner or a designated agent. Service on government agencies usually requires adherence to highly specific statutory requirements, often involving service on a designated official or department. This approach is correct because it directly aligns with the legal mandates designed to ensure that entities receive proper notice of legal proceedings, thereby upholding due process and the integrity of the legal system. Adherence to these specific statutory methods is not optional. It is a fundamental requirement for valid service. An incorrect approach would be to serve any employee of a corporation, regardless of their position or authority. This fails because statutes typically designate specific individuals or roles within a corporation for service of process, and serving a general employee does not guarantee that the document will reach those responsible for legal matters, thus potentially violating due process. Another incorrect approach would be to serve a junior partner in a partnership without confirming their authority or the partnership's designation for service. This is incorrect because partnerships often have specific rules for service, and serving an individual without proper authorization or designation may not constitute valid notice to the partnership as a whole. Finally, serving a general administrative assistant at a government agency without consulting the relevant statutes or agency guidelines is incorrect. Government agencies have very specific statutory requirements for service, often mandating service on a particular legal counsel, department head, or designated agent for service of process, and bypassing these specific requirements renders the service invalid. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes statutory research and verification. Before attempting service, the process server must identify the type of entity being served and the governing jurisdiction. They should then consult the relevant statutes and any applicable court rules to determine the precise method of service authorized for that entity type. If ambiguity exists, seeking clarification from the attorney who issued the process or consulting legal resources is paramount. This methodical approach ensures compliance, protects the integrity of the legal process, and mitigates the risk of improper service. Question 6. Market research demonstrates that clients often seek to expedite legal proceedings by requesting process servers to deviate from standard service protocols. If a client instructs a process server to serve a document on an individual who is not the named defendant but is instead a relative of the defendant present at the defendant's residence, and the client asserts this will be good enough for their purposes, what is the most appropriate course of action for the process server to manage liability and risk? Option A. Advise the client that while not ideal, serving the relative might be acceptable and proceed with service, hoping it will not be challenged. Option B. Politely explain to the client that service must be made strictly in accordance with the rules of civil procedure, specifically identifying who is authorized to accept service on behalf of the defendant, and refuse to serve the relative if they are not an authorized recipient. Option C. Inform the client that the process server cannot provide legal advice and suggest the client consult an attorney before proceeding with any service. Option D. Serve the document on the relative as requested by the client, documenting the client's instruction to satisfy the client's immediate demand. The correct answer is B. Politely explain to the client that service must be made strictly in accordance with the rules of civil procedure, specifically identifying who is authorized to accept service on behalf of the defendant, and refuse to serve the relative if they are not an authorized recipient. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between client instructions and the legal requirements for proper service of process. A process server's primary duty is to ensure valid service that withstands legal scrutiny, thereby protecting the client's case from dismissal due to procedural defects. The client's desire to expedite service by circumventing established protocols creates a significant liability risk for both the process server and the client. Careful judgment is required to balance client satisfaction with adherence to legal mandates. The correct approach involves politely but firmly explaining to the client the legal requirements for service of process, including the specific rules governing who can be served and how. This approach prioritizes regulatory compliance and risk mitigation. By adhering strictly to the established legal framework, the process server ensures that the service is valid, preventing potential challenges to its execution. This upholds the integrity of the legal process and protects the client from adverse outcomes stemming from improper service. This aligns with the ethical obligation of a process server to act with diligence and competence, ensuring that all actions taken are legally sound and in accordance with the rules of civil procedure. An incorrect approach would be to immediately comply with the client's request to serve an unauthorized individual. This failure to adhere to the governing rules of civil procedure would render the service invalid. Such an action exposes the process server to potential liability for professional negligence, as they have failed to perform their duties competently and in accordance with legal standards. Furthermore, it jeopardizes the client's legal action, as the opposing party could move to dismiss the case based on defective service, leading to wasted time and resources. Another incorrect approach would be to attempt to interpret the rules in a way that accommodates the client's request, such as serving someone who is not an authorized recipient but is merely present at the location. This demonstrates a lack of understanding or willful disregard for the precise definitions and requirements of service of process. Such an interpretation is not a valid professional decision-making process. It is a deviation from established legal practice that invites legal challenges and potential sanctions. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a clear understanding of the applicable rules of civil procedure and the process server's ethical obligations. When faced with a client request that appears to conflict with these requirements, the professional should 1. Identify the specific rule or law that governs the situation. 2. Assess the potential risks and liabilities associated with complying with or deviating from the rule. 3. Communicate clearly and professionally with the client, explaining the legal requirements and the rationale behind them. 4. Offer alternative, legally compliant solutions if possible. 5. Document all communications and decisions. This systematic approach ensures that actions are legally defensible and ethically sound, protecting both the process server and the client. Question 7. Consider a scenario where a process server arrives at a residential address to serve a summons and complaint. Upon knocking, the door is opened by the intended recipient, who immediately becomes agitated, raises their voice, and states, "I don't want anything to do with this. Get off my property." The process server is aware that the recipient is legally obligated to accept service. What is the most professional and legally sound course of action for the process server? Option A. Engage in a verbal debate with the individual about their obligation to accept service. Option B. Attempt to physically place the documents in the individual's hand or on their person. Option C. Immediately turn and leave the premises to avoid any potential confrontation. Option D. Calmly identify yourself as a process server, state your purpose, and offer the documents to the individual, explaining that they are legally required to accept them. The correct answer is D. Calmly identify yourself as a process server, state your purpose, and offer the documents to the individual, explaining that they are legally required to accept them. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because the process server is tasked with serving legal documents in a situation that could easily escalate into a confrontation. Maintaining professionalism and decorum is paramount to ensure the service is legally valid, the server's safety, and the integrity of the legal process. The server must balance the duty to serve with the need to de-escalate and avoid unnecessary conflict, all while adhering to the strict procedural requirements of the jurisdiction. The correct approach involves calmly and clearly identifying oneself as a process server, stating the purpose of the visit, and offering the documents to the individual. This method upholds the legal requirement of service by ensuring the recipient is aware of the legal action and has the opportunity to receive the documents. It also demonstrates professionalism by remaining composed and respectful, even in a potentially tense environment. This aligns with the ethical duty of process servers to conduct themselves with integrity and to avoid actions that could prejudice the administration of justice or endanger themselves or others. Adherence to the specific rules of service for the jurisdiction, which typically require proper identification and tender of documents, is also satisfied. An incorrect approach of immediately leaving the premises without attempting service after the recipient's initial aggressive reaction fails to fulfill the duty to serve. This could lead to delays in the legal proceedings and potential sanctions for failing to properly execute the service. Another incorrect approach, that of engaging in an argument or becoming defensive, is unprofessional and could escalate the situation, potentially leading to a breach of the peace or even physical altercations. Such behavior undermines the credibility of the process server and the legal system they represent. Furthermore, it risks compromising the validity of the service if the interaction becomes so contentious that the documents are not properly tendered or accepted. A third incorrect approach, that of attempting to force the documents on the individual against their will, is also unprofessional and could lead to assault charges or other legal repercussions for the process server, rendering the service invalid and potentially jeopardizing the case. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes de-escalation, clear communication, and adherence to legal and ethical standards. This involves assessing the situation quickly, remaining calm, identifying oneself and purpose, and offering the documents in a non-confrontational manner. If the recipient remains hostile or refuses service, the server should disengage respectfully and consult with their client or supervisor regarding next steps, rather than resorting to aggressive tactics or abandoning the duty to serve without proper cause. Question 8. The audit findings indicate that in a recent case, a process server encountered repeated difficulties serving a defendant at their primary residence. The defendant was consistently absent during attempted service hours. The process server, after 3 unsuccessful attempts over a week, decided to leave the documents with a neighbor who was present at the time, without confirming if the neighbor was a responsible adult or had any obligation to deliver the documents to the defendant. The process server then filed a proof of service indicating the documents were left with a neighbor. Which of the following approaches best upholds the constitutional implications of service in this scenario? Option A. Document all attempts at the defendant's residence, then seek court authorization for an alternative method of service that is reasonably calculated to give notice. Option B. Cease all service attempts after the 3rd unsuccessful attempt at the defendant's residence, assuming the defendant is evading service. Option C. Leave the documents with the first available person at the defendant's residence, regardless of their relationship to the defendant, and file proof of service. Option D. Serve a family member of the defendant who lives in a different city, without confirming if that family member will inform the defendant of the lawsuit. Correct answer is A. Document all attempts at the defendant's residence, then seek court authorization for an alternative method of service that is reasonably calculated to give notice. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it pits the process server's duty to effect proper service against potential constitutional rights of the defendant, specifically the right to due process. The process server must navigate the legal requirements for service while ensuring the defendant is not deprived of notice in a manner that violates their fundamental rights. Careful judgment is required to balance these competing demands. The correct approach involves diligently attempting service through all statutorily authorized methods, documenting each attempt thoroughly, and then, if personal service remains impossible, seeking court authorization for an alternative method of service that is reasonably calculated to give notice. This approach is right because it adheres to the procedural due process requirements enshrined in the Constitution. The 14th Amendment, for instance, mandates that no state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Due process, in the context of legal proceedings, fundamentally requires notice and an opportunity to be heard. Service of process is the mechanism by which notice is constitutionally conferred. By exhausting all reasonable means of personal service, and then seeking court approval for an alternative method, the process server demonstrates a good faith effort to provide actual notice, or, at the very least, constructive notice that is constitutionally sufficient. This aligns with the principle that service must be reasonably calculated to apprise the interested parties of the pendency of the action. An incorrect approach of simply leaving the documents with a neighbor without verifying their willingness or ability to deliver them to the defendant is a regulatory and ethical failure. This method does not guarantee that the defendant will receive notice, thereby potentially violating their due process rights. It bypasses the established legal framework for service and relies on an assumption that is not legally sound. Another incorrect approach of ceasing all attempts after the first unsuccessful attempt at the defendant's residence is also a failure. This demonstrates a lack of diligence and a disregard for the process server's obligation to effect service. The law generally requires multiple attempts and exploration of various authorized methods before concluding that service is impossible. This failure to pursue all avenues could lead to a finding that the defendant was not properly notified, thus infringing upon their due process rights. Finally, an incorrect approach of serving a family member who is known to be estranged from the defendant and unlikely to inform them of the legal action is also a failure. While serving a family member might be permissible under certain circumstances, the process server has a responsibility to consider whether such service is reasonably calculated to provide actual notice. If the process server knows or has reason to believe the family member will not deliver the documents, this method becomes constitutionally infirm, as it fails to provide adequate notice. A professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a thorough understanding of the relevant jurisdictional rules of civil procedure governing service of process. This includes knowing the authorized methods of service and the requirements for substituted service or service by publication. When faced with difficulties in effecting service, the process server should maintain a detailed log of all attempts, noting the date, time, location, and circumstances of each attempt. If personal service proves elusive, The next step should be to consult with the attorney who issued the process to discuss seeking court authorization for an alternative method of service that offers the greatest likelihood of apprising the defendant of the lawsuit, thereby upholding constitutional due process. Question 9. The monitoring system demonstrates that a process server has been assigned to serve a summons and complaint on an individual who is a close personal friend, a fact not initially disclosed to the law firm that retained the server. The process server is aware of this relationship and its potential to create an appearance of impropriety. Which of the following represents the most ethically sound and legally compliant approach for the process server in this situation? Option A. Immediately cease all attempts to serve the documents and inform the retaining law firm of the personal relationship and the potential conflict of interest, requesting guidance on how to proceed or offering to recuse themselves from the assignment. Option B. Attempt to serve the documents discreetly, hoping the personal relationship will not be discovered, and rely on their ability to perform the service impartially regardless of the personal connection. Option C. Proceed with serving the documents as assigned, assuming their professional integrity will prevent any bias, and only disclose the relationship if it becomes an issue during legal proceedings. Option D. Delegate the service of process to a colleague within the same firm, without informing the retaining law firm of the personal relationship or the delegation. Correct answer is A. Immediately cease all attempts to serve the documents and inform the retaining law firm of the personal relationship and the potential conflict of interest, requesting guidance on how to proceed or offering to recuse themselves from the assignment. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a process server to navigate a situation where their professional duties could be perceived as compromised due to a personal relationship. Maintaining public trust and adhering to the principles of impartiality and fairness are paramount in the legal system. A process server's role is to ensure due process by delivering legal documents accurately and impartially, without bias or undue influence. The core challenge lies in upholding the integrity of the service of process, while managing a potential conflict of interest that could undermine the perception of fairness and legality. Careful judgment is required to identify and mitigate any situation that could lead to even the appearance of impropriety. The correct approach involves proactively disclosing the relationship to the relevant parties and seeking guidance or recusal. This demonstrates a commitment to transparency and ethical conduct. By informing the court, the law firm, and potentially the opposing party, through their counsel, the process server allows for an informed decision to be made regarding the continuation of service. This aligns with the ethical obligations of process servers to act with integrity and avoid situations that could compromise their neutrality. Regulatory frameworks and professional guidelines for process servers often emphasize the importance of disclosing potential conflicts of interest to ensure the impartiality of the legal process. This proactive disclosure prevents any later claims of bias or unfair advantage. An incorrect approach that involves proceeding with service without disclosure fails to uphold the principle of transparency. This could lead to challenges to the validity of the service, accusations of bias, and damage to the reputation of the process server and the legal system. It violates the ethical duty to avoid even the appearance of impropriety. Another incorrect approach, such as attempting to conceal the relationship, is a direct violation of ethical standards and potentially legal requirements. Concealment is inherently deceptive and undermines the trust placed in process servers. It creates a situation where the service could be deemed invalid if discovered, leading to significant legal repercussions. Finally, an incorrect approach that involves delegating the service to a colleague without proper disclosure or consideration of the implications for the overall case integrity is also problematic. While delegation might seem like a solution, if not handled with full transparency and consideration of the conflict, it can still lead to issues. The responsibility for ensuring the integrity of the service ultimately rests with the process server who identified the conflict. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a clear step-by-step evaluation. 1. Identify the potential conflict. Recognize any personal, financial, or professional relationship that could influence or appear to influence the performance of duties. 2. Assess the severity. Determine the degree to which the relationship could impact impartiality and the integrity of the service. 3. Consult relevant regulations and ethical guidelines. Review the specific rules governing process servers in the applicable jurisdiction. 4. Disclose proactively. Inform all relevant parties, court, attorneys, etc. About the potential conflict. 5. Seek guidance or recusal. Request instructions from the court or the hiring attorney or offer to recuse oneself from the service if appropriate. 6. Document all actions. Keep a record of the conflict, the disclosure, and any decisions made. Question 10. The performance metrics show a consistent pattern of process servers completing assignments within their standard turnaround times, but a recent internal review has highlighted a potential issue where several cases are nearing their statutory limitation periods without confirmed service. A process server receives a new assignment with a known statute of limitations deadline that is only 2 weeks away. The client has provided an address that has been unresponsive to previous attempts. Which of the following actions best upholds the process server's professional responsibilities and adheres to the principles of timely legal service? Option A. Continue with standard service attempts at the provided address, assuming the client is aware of the statute of limitations and will take further action if service is not achieved within the remaining time. Option B. Inform the client that the statute of limitations is approaching, but state that the process server cannot offer advice on how to proceed, leaving the client to determine the next steps independently. Option C. Immediately inform the client of the approaching statute of limitations deadline, detailing the challenges with the current address, and advising on the urgency of providing updated information or authorizing alternative service strategies to ensure completion before the deadline. Option D. Prioritize this assignment above all others and attempt service multiple times daily at the provided address, without notifying the client of the approaching deadline, believing that aggressive attempts will suffice. The correct answer is C. Immediately inform the client of the approaching statute of limitations deadline, detailing the challenges with the current address, and advising on the urgency of providing updated information or authorizing alternative service strategies to ensure completion before the deadline. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because statutes of limitations are strict legal deadlines that, if missed, can permanently bar a plaintiff from pursuing their claim. A process server's role in ensuring timely service is critical to upholding the integrity of the legal process and protecting their clients' rights. Failure to serve within the statutory period, or to take appropriate steps when approaching such a deadline, can have severe consequences for the plaintiff and reflect poorly on the process server's competence and adherence to professional standards. Careful judgment is required to balance the need for thoroughness with the urgency imposed by these deadlines. The correct approach involves proactively identifying and communicating potential statute of limitations issues to the client. This demonstrates a commitment to due diligence and client advocacy. By alerting the client to the approaching deadline and advising on the necessity of timely service, the process server empowers the client to make informed decisions and take necessary actions, such as providing updated information or authorizing expedited service. This aligns with the ethical obligation to act in the best interest of the client and to uphold the principles of justice by ensuring claims are not extinguished due to procedural oversight. Regulatory frameworks for process servers often emphasize diligence and communication, especially when critical legal deadlines are involved. An incorrect approach would be to ignore or downplay the approaching statute of limitations. This failure to communicate a critical legal deadline to the client is a significant ethical and professional lapse. It deprives the client of the opportunity to act, potentially leading to the loss of their legal claim. This inaction could be construed as negligence and a breach of the duty of care owed to the client. Furthermore, it undermines the legal process by allowing a claim to become time-barred due to procedural failure, which is contrary to the principles of justice. Another incorrect approach would be to assume the client is aware of the statute of limitations and to proceed with service without any specific attention to the deadline. While clients are ultimately responsible for their legal matters, a professional process server has a responsibility to flag critical issues that directly impact the viability of their service and the client's case. This passive stance fails to provide the proactive support expected of a professional service provider and can lead to the same detrimental outcome as actively ignoring the deadline. A professional reasoning process for similar situations should involve a proactive risk assessment. When undertaking service, a process server should inquire about or be aware of any critical deadlines, particularly statutes of limitations. If such a deadline is approaching and service has not been completed, the server must immediately communicate this to the client, outlining the implications and recommending prompt action. This communication should be documented. The server should then follow the client's instructions, prioritizing service that ensures compliance with the deadline. If the client is unresponsive or unable to facilitate timely service, the server should document these efforts and advise the client of the potential consequences. Question 11. Benchmark analysis indicates that process servers often encounter situations where clients seek their interpretation of legal documents or advice on legal strategy. A client, after being served with a complex legal document, asks the process server, "Can you tell me if this service is valid? And what do you think I should do next to defend myself?" Which of the following is the most appropriate response for the process server to ensure compliance with regulations against the unauthorized practice of law? Option A. Provide a general overview of the legal process involved in such cases, without commenting on the specifics of the client's situation. Option B. Offer an opinion on the validity of the service and suggest specific legal actions the client might consider taking to defend themselves. Option C. Explain the legal implications of the document and predict the likely court ruling based on their experience. Option D. Politely decline to offer any legal interpretation or advice, stating that they are not qualified to do so and recommending the client consult with a licensed attorney. The correct answer is D. Politely decline to offer any legal interpretation or advice, stating that they are not qualified to do so and recommending the client consult with a licensed attorney. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a process server to navigate the fine line between providing helpful information and engaging in the unauthorized practice of law. Process servers are authorized to serve legal documents and provide related administrative support. However, offering legal advice, interpreting legal documents, or suggesting legal strategies constitutes practicing law without a license, which is illegal and unethical. The pressure to assist a client, coupled with a lack of legal training, can lead to missteps. Careful judgment is required to ensure all actions remain strictly within the scope of a process server's duties. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves politely but firmly declining to offer legal advice or interpretation. This upholds the process server's professional boundaries and adheres to regulations prohibiting the unauthorized practice of law. By stating clearly that they are not qualified to provide legal advice and recommending the client consult with a licensed attorney, the process server avoids any potential legal or ethical violations. This aligns with the principle that only licensed legal professionals can offer legal counsel. Incorrect approach is analysis. Offering an opinion on the validity of the service or the potential outcome of the case is an incorrect approach. This directly constitutes offering legal advice and interpretation, which is beyond the scope of a process server's authority and is considered the unauthorized practice of law. It could mislead the client and have serious legal repercussions for both the client and the process server. Suggesting specific legal actions the client should take, such as filing a counterclaim or seeking a particular type of relief, is also an incorrect approach. This is a clear instance of providing legal strategy and advice, which is the exclusive domain of licensed attorneys. Such actions could lead the client down an incorrect legal path, causing harm. Explaining the legal implications of the document or predicting the likely court ruling is another incorrect approach. This involves interpreting legal documents and predicting legal outcomes, which requires legal expertise and a license to practice law. A process server's role is to facilitate the delivery of legal documents, not to analyze their content or consequences. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this field should adopt a decision-making framework that prioritizes adherence to legal and ethical boundaries. When faced with requests that verge on legal advice, the process server should 1. Recognize the request as potentially falling outside their professional scope. 2. Clearly and politely state their limitations, emphasizing they are not licensed to provide legal advice. 3. Advise the individual to seek counsel from a qualified attorney. 4. Document the interaction, noting the request made and the response provided, to maintain a record of professional conduct. This framework ensures that the process server acts within their authorized capacity and protects both themselves and the public from the dangers of unauthorized legal practice. Question 12. Market research demonstrates that a plaintiff in California has filed a lawsuit against a software developer based in Texas, alleging breach of contract due to a faulty software product sold to the plaintiff's business in California. The software developer has no physical offices or employees in California, but advertises its products online and has sold software to several other businesses in California. The process server is tasked with serving the Texas-based developer. Which of the following approaches best ensures compliance with California's long-arm statute and due process requirements for establishing personal jurisdiction? Option A. Serve the defendant at its Texas address, and then file a motion with the California court to compel the defendant to appear, arguing that the defendant's general business activities in California are sufficient for jurisdiction. Option B. Serve the defendant at its Texas address, assuming that the sale of software into California and online advertising constitutes sufficient minimum contacts for California courts to exercise jurisdiction under its long-arm statute. Option C. Serve the defendant at its Texas address, but only after confirming that the defendant has a registered agent for service of process in California. Option D. Advise the client that service in Texas is not possible for a California lawsuit and recommend dismissing the case. Correct answer is B. Serve the defendant at its Texas address, assuming that the sale of software into California and online advertising constitutes sufficient minimum contacts for California courts to exercise jurisdiction under its long-arm statute. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a process server to navigate the complexities of interstate service of process, specifically concerning the application of long-arm statutes. The server must exercise careful judgment to ensure compliance with the jurisdictional requirements of the forum state, which dictates the extent to which its courts can exercise power over a non-resident defendant. Failure to properly establish personal jurisdiction can render any subsequent judgment unenforceable, wasting significant resources and potentially harming the client's case. The core of the challenge lies in understanding the nexus between the defendant's actions and the cause of action, as defined by the long-arm statute and interpreted by relevant case law. The correct approach involves a thorough understanding and application of the forum state's long-arm statute and its constitutional limitations, as established by due process. This means verifying that the defendant has sufficient minimum contacts with the forum state such that exercising jurisdiction does not offend traditional notions of fair play and substantial justice. This requires analyzing whether the defendant purposefully availed itself of the privilege of conducting activities within the forum state, whether the litigation arises out of or relates to those activities, and whether the exercise of jurisdiction is reasonable. The process server's role is to gather information and effect service in a manner that supports the client's ability to demonstrate these jurisdictional predicates, adhering strictly to the procedural rules of the forum state. An incorrect approach would be to assume that simply serving the defendant in their home state is sufficient, without considering the forum state's long-arm statute. This fails to acknowledge that personal jurisdiction is a fundamental requirement for a court to hear a case against a non-resident. Another incorrect approach would be to rely solely on the defendant's general presence or business dealings within the forum state, without ensuring those dealings are directly related to the cause of action, as often required by specific long-arm statutes. This overlooks the distinction between general and specific personal jurisdiction. A further incorrect approach would be to proceed with service without confirming the specific long-arm statute of the forum state and its interpretation by the courts, potentially leading to service that does not establish jurisdiction. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a multi-step analysis. First, identify the forum state and the specific cause of action. Second, research the forum state's long-arm statute and relevant case law interpreting its scope and constitutional limitations. Third, assess the defendant's connection to the forum state in relation to the cause of action, looking for evidence of purposeful availment and a nexus between the contacts and the litigation. Fourth, determine the appropriate method of service under the forum state's rules and any applicable federal rules if the case is in federal court. Finally, execute service meticulously, ensuring all documentation and procedures align with jurisdictional requirements. Question 13. The efficiency study reveals that a significant number of process servers are attempting to expedite service by making assumptions about recipient identity and service location. A process server is tasked with serving a summons and complaint on John Doe at 123 Main Street. Upon arrival, a person who vaguely resembles a photograph of John Doe is present, but the server cannot definitively confirm their identity. Server proceeds with service. Later, the server is instructed to serve Jane Smith at her residence, but she is not home. The server leaves the documents with her 10-year-old child who answers the door, without confirming the child's understanding or ability to deliver the documents. Which of the following actions demonstrates adherence to legal and ethical standards for process servers? Option A. The server should have served the person at 123 Main Street, as a visual resemblance is sufficient for service. For Jane Smith, leaving the document with her child is a reasonable attempt at substituted service. Option B. The server should have first attempted to definitively confirm the identity of the person at 123 Main Street, and if unsuccessful, followed established procedures for substituted service or due diligence before leaving. For Jane Smith, the server should have investigated legally permissible methods for substituted service, such as leaving with another adult resident of suitable age and discretion, or seeking court authorization for alternative service, rather than leaving the documents with a minor. Option C. The server should have served the person at 123 Main Street, assuming they were John Doe given the resemblance, to ensure timely service. For Jane Smith, leaving the documents with her child is acceptable as it ensures the documents are at the residence. Option D. The server should have served the person at 123 Main Street, as the resemblance was close enough to proceed. For Jane Smith, the server should have returned multiple times to attempt personal service, even if it meant delaying the overall efficiency of the process. The correct answer is B. The server should have first attempted to definitively confirm the identity of the person at 123 Main Street, and if unsuccessful, followed established procedures for substituted service or due diligence before leaving. For Jane Smith, the server should have investigated legally permissible methods for substituted service, such as leaving with another adult resident of suitable age and discretion, or seeking court authorization for alternative service, rather than leaving the documents with a minor. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires a process server to balance the imperative of efficient service delivery with the absolute necessity of adhering to legal and ethical standards. The pressure to complete a high volume of services quickly can create a temptation to cut corners, which could lead to serious legal repercussions and damage to professional reputation. Careful judgment is required to ensure that efficiency gains do not compromise the integrity of the legal process or the rights of the parties involved. The correct approach involves meticulously verifying the identity of the recipient and the service address against the court documents and relevant jurisdictional rules before attempting service. This ensures that service is legally valid and that the correct party is notified. Specifically, adhering to the Advanced Process Server Certification exams jurisdictions' rules regarding personal service, substituted service, and due diligence is paramount. This approach upholds the fundamental legal principle that a party must be properly notified of legal proceedings against them, ensuring due process. It aligns with ethical obligations to act with honesty, integrity, and competence, and to uphold the law. An incorrect approach that involves serving a person who vaguely resembles the defendant but whose identity cannot be definitively confirmed is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This violates the core requirement of proper identification, potentially leading to service on the wrong individual, which is legally void and unethical. It undermines the integrity of the judicial process by failing to ensure the intended defendant is actually notified. Another incorrect approach, serving a document at an address that is not the defendant's usual place of abode or business, without first exhausting all legally permissible methods of attempting personal service, is also a failure. This bypasses established legal procedures for substituted service, which typically require a showing of due diligence in attempting personal service and specific authorization, or adherence to strict rules for alternative methods. This demonstrates a lack of competence and disregard for the established legal framework governing process serving. Finally, an incorrect approach that involves leaving documents with a minor at a residence, without confirming they are of suitable age and discretion to understand and deliver the documents to the intended recipient, or without meeting specific statutory requirements for service on a minor, is a critical failure. This not only risks the documents not reaching the intended party, but also violates specific rules designed to protect minors and ensure proper notification in such circumstances. It shows a lack of understanding of specific service requirements and a disregard for ethical considerations regarding vulnerable individuals. The professional reasoning process for similar situations should involve a constant reference to the specific rules of civil procedure and any applicable statutes within the relevant jurisdiction. Before any service attempt, a process server must confirm the identity of the defendant and the validity of the service address. If personal service is not immediately possible, the server must consult the rules to determine the legally permissible methods of substituted service and diligently follow those procedures. Ethical considerations, such as ensuring the integrity of the process and avoiding harm or prejudice to any party, must always guide decision-making. When in doubt, seeking clarification from the court or legal counsel is a responsible and professional course of action. Question 14. The audit findings indicate a pattern of process servers occasionally handling sensitive personal information during the course of their duties. In one instance, a process server was tasked with serving documents containing financial details and medical records. The server, aiming for efficiency, considered several methods for ensuring the recipient's legal counsel received these documents promptly. Which of the following represents the most appropriate and legally compliant method for the process server to handle and transmit this sensitive information? Option A. Retain the documents in the process server's personal vehicle until the next scheduled delivery to the same legal firm. Option B. Leave the documents in the recipient's mailbox, ensuring it is a secure, locked mailbox. Option C. Inform the recipient of the contents of the sensitive documents over the phone to expedite their awareness. Option D. Securely transmit the documents directly to the recipient's legal counsel via a trusted courier service or encrypted digital transfer, confirming receipt with the counsel's office. The correct answer is D. Securely transmit the documents directly to the recipient's legal counsel via a trusted courier service or encrypted digital transfer, confirming receipt with the counsel's office. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a process server to balance the immediate need to fulfill a service of process with the overarching legal and ethical obligations to protect sensitive personal information. Potential for misuse or unauthorized disclosure of such information, even if unintentional, carries significant legal ramifications and can severely damage the reputation of the process server and the legal system. Careful judgment is required to ensure compliance with all applicable regulations while effectively performing their duties. The correct approach involves securely transmitting the sensitive information to the intended recipient's legal counsel, who is authorized to receive it on behalf of the client. This method ensures that the information is handled by professionals bound by attorney-client privilege and professional conduct rules, thereby minimizing the risk of unauthorized access or disclosure. This aligns with the principles of data privacy and security mandated by relevant regulations, which emphasize the need for secure handling and transmission of confidential information. An incorrect approach that involves leaving the sensitive documents in a publicly accessible location, such as a mailbox without proper security, fails to adequately protect the information. This directly violates the duty of care owed to the individual whose information is being handled and exposes them to potential identity theft or other forms of harm. Such an action would likely contravene data protection laws and professional ethical standards that require reasonable measures to prevent unauthorized access. Another incorrect approach, such as retaining the sensitive documents indefinitely without a clear legal basis or secure storage, also presents significant risks. This creates a persistent vulnerability for data breaches and could be seen as a failure to properly dispose of or secure confidential information as required by law and best practices. It demonstrates a lack of diligence in managing sensitive data throughout its life cycle. Finally, an incorrect approach that involves discussing the contents of the sensitive documents with unauthorized individuals, even if seemingly innocuous, constitutes a breach of confidentiality. This violates privacy laws and ethical codes that strictly prohibit the disclosure of personal information to those not legally entitled to it. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes data security and legal compliance. This involves understanding the nature of the information being handled, identifying potential risks, and selecting the most secure and legally compliant method for its transmission and storage. When in doubt, consulting with legal counsel or a supervisor regarding the proper handling of sensitive information is a crucial step in maintaining professional integrity and avoiding legal repercussions. Question 15. Operational review demonstrates that a process server is tasked with serving a summons and complaint on John A. Smith at a residential address. The server arrives and observes an individual matching a general physical description from the case file exiting the property. The individual states, "I'm John Smith," when asked if they are the defendant. What is the most appropriate method for the process server to identify the defendant in this scenario? Adhering strictly to the regulatory framework for process serving. Option A. Accept the individual's verbal confirmation of their identity and proceed with service. Option B. Request to see a government-issued photo identification that matches the name and address on the legal documents. Option C. Attempt to locate a neighbor who can confirm the individual's identity. Option D. Note the individual's general physical resemblance to the description and proceed with service based on their statement. The correct answer is A. Accept the individual's verbal confirmation of their identity and proceed with service. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because the process server must ensure the accuracy of the defendant's identity to comply with legal service requirements, thereby preventing potential legal challenges to the validity of the service. Failure to properly identify the defendant can lead to motions to dismiss, wasted resources, and reputational damage. Careful judgment is required to balance efficiency with the absolute necessity of correct identification. The correct approach involves utilizing multiple, verifiable sources of information to confirm the defendant's identity. This aligns with the fundamental principle of due process, which requires that legal documents be served upon the correct individual. Regulatory frameworks, such as those governing civil procedure, implicitly and explicitly mandate that service be effected on the named defendant. Relying on a single, unverified source, such as a casual observation or a brief interaction without corroboration, falls short of the diligence required. The correct approach, which involves cross-referencing information from official records, reliable databases, and potentially direct, verified interaction, ensures a high degree of certainty and minimizes the risk of misidentification. This proactive and thorough method is ethically sound and legally defensible, upholding the integrity of the judicial process. An incorrect approach that relies solely on a visual resemblance without further verification is professionally unacceptable. This fails to meet the standard of reasonable diligence expected of a process server. The legal framework requires more than a subjective assessment. It demands objective confirmation. Serving a document on someone who merely looks like the defendant, even if the server believes it to be them, can constitute improper service. This can lead to the defendant claiming they were never properly notified of the legal action, potentially resulting in the case being dismissed or delayed. Another incorrect approach, such as accepting a self-identification from an individual without any independent verification, is also professionally deficient. While an individual might claim to be the defendant, there is no guarantee of their honesty or accuracy. This method bypasses the crucial step of corroboration, leaving the service vulnerable to challenge. The regulatory expectation is for the process server to act as an impartial agent of the court, ensuring that service is effected correctly, not simply relying on the word of the person being served, especially when that person has a vested interest in the outcome. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic approach to identity verification. This begins with reviewing all available documentation for identifying information. Next, it involves utilizing reliable, authorized databases and public records to cross-reference this information. If further confirmation is needed and permissible by law and ethical guidelines, a brief, non-intrusive interaction with the individual, coupled with a request for verifiable identification, such as a driver's license or other government-issued ID, should be considered. The overarching principle is to achieve a high degree of certainty regarding the defendant's identity before completing service, thereby safeguarding the integrity of the legal process and the rights of all parties involved. Question 16. Risk assessment procedures indicate that a client, who is the defendant in a civil lawsuit, has expressed significant concern about being personally served at their place of employment due to potential workplace repercussions and reputational damage. The client has requested that the process server find an alternative method of service that avoids their workplace entirely, even if it means delaying the service. What is the most appropriate course of action for the process server? Option A. Refuse to serve the process at the client's workplace and inform them that they will have to find another process server who is willing to accommodate their request for an alternative method. Option B. Attempt to serve the process at the client's residence without prior notification or confirmation, hoping to avoid the workplace altogether, even if it means deviating from the most direct service address provided. Option C. Inform the client that while their concerns are understood, service must be effected as per legal requirements, and offer to discuss legally permissible alternative service methods that might address their concerns, such as substituted service at their residence if authorized, or serving a designated agent, while emphasizing the need for timely service. Option D. Advise the client on strategies to avoid being served at their workplace, such as taking extended leave or being absent during usual service hours, to facilitate a later service attempt at a more convenient time. The correct answer is C. Inform the client that while their concerns are understood, service must be effected as per legal requirements, and offer to discuss legally permissible alternative service methods that might address their concerns, such as substituted service at their residence if authorized, or serving a designated agent, while emphasizing the need for timely service. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between client confidentiality and the legal obligation to serve process accurately and effectively. A process server must balance the need to protect sensitive client information with the imperative to fulfill their statutory duties without compromising the integrity of the legal process. This requires careful judgment to avoid actions that could lead to legal repercussions, ethical breaches, or reputational damage. The correct approach involves a proactive and transparent communication strategy with the client, clearly outlining the legal requirements for service and the potential consequences of non-compliance. This demonstrates a commitment to both client interests and legal obligations. By informing the client of the necessity of service and offering to discuss alternative methods that might mitigate their concerns, the process server upholds their professional duty of care and ethical responsibility. This aligns with the principles of professional conduct that emphasize honesty, diligence, and adherence to legal mandates. An incorrect approach of refusing service outright without proper consultation or explanation fails to acknowledge the legal imperative of service of process. This could be interpreted as obstruction of justice or a dereliction of professional duty, potentially leading to disciplinary action. Another incorrect approach of attempting to serve the process surreptitiously or by misrepresenting oneself to gain access would violate ethical guidelines regarding honesty and integrity, and could also have legal ramifications for the process server and the party they represent. This undermines the trust inherent in the legal system. A further incorrect approach of advising the client on how to evade service, even if framed as helpful advice, crosses ethical boundaries. Process servers are not legal counsel and should not provide advice that facilitates the avoidance of legal proceedings. This could lead to accusations of aiding and abetting and professional misconduct. A professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a clear understanding of the legal framework governing service of process. When faced with a client's reluctance or objection, the process server should first ascertain the specific nature of the client's concern. If the concern relates to privacy or potential negative repercussions, the process server should explain their professional obligations and the legal requirements for service. They should then offer to explore legitimate, legally permissible alternatives for service that might address the client's concerns, such as substituted service if applicable and legally permissible, or discussing the matter with the client's legal counsel. Throughout this process, maintaining clear, honest, and documented communication with the client is paramount. Question 17. Strategic planning requires a process server to determine the most effective and legally compliant method for serving legal documents on a defendant located in a different state from the court where the action was filed. Considering the advanced process server certification, exams focus on jurisdictional considerations. Which of the following approaches best exemplifies a process server's professional responsibility in this scenario? Option A. Delegating the determination of the correct service method to the client, as they are most familiar with the case details. Option B. Verifying and adhering to the rules of civil procedure of both the originating court and the jurisdiction where service will be effected, ensuring compliance with all applicable statutes. Option C. Prioritizing the fastest and most convenient method of service, regardless of specific jurisdictional requirements. Option D. Relying solely on the service of process rules of the originating court, assuming they are universally applicable. The correct answer is D. relying solely on the service of process rules of the originating court, assuming they are universally applicable. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a process server to navigate the complexities of interstate service of process, where the laws of multiple jurisdictions could potentially apply. A process server must exercise meticulous judgment to ensure compliance with the specific rules governing the originating court and the jurisdiction where service is to be effected. Failure to do so can lead to the dismissal of the case, significant delays, and potential liability for the process server. The correct approach involves understanding and adhering to the rules of civil procedure of the originating court and any applicable state or federal statutes governing service of process in the target jurisdiction. This means verifying that the chosen method of service is permissible in both the court's jurisdiction and the location where the defendant is to be served. For example, if a New York court issues a summons and complaint, and the defendant resides in California, the process server must ensure that the method of service used complies with both New York's rules for out-of-state service and California's rules for service within its borders. This often involves consulting the specific rules of civil procedure for both states, such as New York Civil Practice Law and Rules, CPLR, and California Code of Civil Procedure, CCP. This ensures that the service is legally valid and will be recognized by the court, preventing challenges to jurisdiction. An incorrect approach would be to assume that the rules of the originating court are sufficient for service in another state without verification. This fails to acknowledge that each state has its own sovereign authority and specific requirements for asserting jurisdiction over individuals or entities within its territory. Relying solely on the originating court's rules could lead to service methods that are not recognized or permitted in the target jurisdiction, rendering the service defective. Another incorrect approach is to prioritize speed or convenience over legal compliance. This might involve using a method of service that is quicker to execute, but is not authorized by the relevant rules of civil procedure. Such an approach disregards the fundamental due process rights of the defendant, who is entitled to proper notice of legal proceedings. A third incorrect approach is to delegate the responsibility for determining the correct jurisdictional service method to the client or an inexperienced subordinate without independent verification. While clients may have general knowledge, they are not legal experts, and subordinates may lack the specialized knowledge required for interstate service. The ultimate responsibility for ensuring proper service rests with the process server. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying the originating court and the location of the party to be served. They must then research and understand the specific rules of civil procedure governing service in both jurisdictions. This includes consulting official court rules, relevant statutes, and if necessary, seeking guidance from legal counsel. Verification of the chosen method against these rules is paramount before attempting service. This systematic and diligent approach ensures legal compliance and upholds the integrity of the judicial process. Question 18. The audit findings indicate a pattern of process servers utilizing various methods to serve individuals residing within the state. One server consistently opts for leaving documents with a cohabitant at the individual's residence, even when that cohabitant is not an adult family member or otherwise authorized by statute. Another server primarily uses certified mail with a return receipt requested, ensuring the receipt is signed by the named individual. A third server occasionally uses standard mail for initial service attempts, without any requirement for confirmation of delivery. Which of these approaches best aligns with the principles of establishing proper jurisdiction for service on individuals within the state? Option A. Sending documents via standard mail without any requirement for confirmation of delivery. Option B. Utilizing certified mail with a return receipt requested, ensuring the receipt is signed by the named individual. Option C. A combination of all the above methods, as long as some attempt at delivery is made. Option D. Relying on leaving documents with a cohabitant who is not an authorized recipient under state law. The correct answer is D. Relying on leaving documents with a cohabitant who is not an authorized recipient under state law. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires a process server to navigate the nuances of establishing proper jurisdiction for service on an individual within the state, balancing efficiency with strict adherence to legal requirements. The audit findings suggest a potential deviation from established best practices, necessitating a careful evaluation of different service methods. The core of the challenge lies in ensuring that the chosen method of service is legally valid and will withstand scrutiny, thereby preventing potential challenges to the jurisdiction of the court. The correct approach involves prioritizing methods of service that are explicitly permitted by state law for individuals residing within the state, and that provide the strongest evidence of delivery. This typically includes personal service by a sheriff or authorized process server, or service by certified mail with return receipt requested, where permitted and properly executed. The regulatory framework for process serving within the state mandates that service must be reasonably calculated to give notice to the defendant. Personal service is generally considered the most robust method as it provides direct proof of delivery to the individual. Service by mail, when authorized, requires strict adherence to mailing procedures and confirmation of receipt. An incorrect approach would be to rely on methods that are not explicitly authorized by state statute for service on individuals within the state, or that offer weaker proof of delivery. For instance, leaving documents with a roommate who is not an authorized recipient under the law, or sending documents via standard mail without a requirement for a return receipt, fails to meet the legal standard for providing notice. These methods are problematic because they do not guarantee that the individual will actually receive the documents, and they lack the clear evidentiary trail required to demonstrate proper service. Such actions could lead to a dismissal of the case for lack of jurisdiction, professional reprimand, and potential liability for the process server. Professionals should employ a decision-making process that begins with a thorough understanding of the specific state's rules of civil procedure governing service of process on individuals. This involves consulting the relevant statutes and case law. When faced with multiple potential service methods, the server should always select the method that offers the highest degree of certainty in establishing proper jurisdiction and providing legally sufficient notice, while also considering cost-effectiveness and efficiency. If there is any ambiguity regarding the validity of a particular service method, it is prudent to seek clarification from the client or legal counsel, or to opt for a more traditional and universally accepted method of service. Question 19. The control framework reveals that process servers face potential liabilities stemming from their actions during service. If a process server is attempting to serve a defendant who is actively evading them, and the server observes the defendant entering their private residence, but the server is not authorized by statute or court order to force entry, what is the most appropriate course of action to mitigate potential liabilities? Option A. Attempt to serve the defendant by leaving the documents at the residence with a neighbor who is known to the defendant, believing this constitutes valid substituted service. Option B. Serve the documents on a family member who answers the door, even if that family member is a minor and clearly not authorized to accept service. Option C. Force entry into the private residence to effect service, arguing that the defendant's evasion justifies the action. Option D. Wait outside the residence for an extended period, hoping the defendant will exit, and if they do not, document the attempts and inform the client of the inability to serve. The correct answer is A. Attempt to serve the defendant by leaving the documents at the residence with a neighbor who is known to the defendant, believing this constitutes valid substituted service. Explanation. The control framework reveals that process servers operate within a highly regulated environment where adherence to specific legal procedures is paramount. Potential liabilities associated with service are significant and can arise from various sources, including improper service, failure to adhere to statutory timeframes, or actions that constitute harassment or trespass. A professionally challenging scenario involves balancing the duty to effect service with the obligation to act lawfully and ethically, particularly when faced with evasive individuals or complex service situations. Careful judgment is required to navigate these complexities without exposing oneself or the client to legal repercussions. Correct approach involves meticulously following all statutory requirements for service, including proper identification of the party being served, correct method of delivery as prescribed by law, and accurate completion of the proof of service. This approach is right because it directly aligns with the fundamental principles of due process and the legal framework governing process serving. Adherence to these regulations minimizes the risk of service being deemed invalid, thereby preventing potential claims of improper service, which could lead to dismissal of the underlying legal action or even civil liability for the server. It also upholds the integrity of the judicial process. An incorrect approach of attempting to serve a party by leaving documents with a clearly unauthorized individual, such as a minor child or a person who explicitly refuses to accept the documents and is not designated for substituted service, is professionally unacceptable. This failure constitutes improper service, as it does not meet the legal definition of delivery to the party or their authorized representative. Such an action could result in the service being quashed, leading to delays and increased costs for the client, and potentially expose the process server to liability for negligence or malfeasance. Another incorrect approach involves misrepresenting one's identity or purpose to gain access to a party for the purpose of service. This is ethically reprehensible and can have severe legal consequences, including charges of fraud or misrepresentation, and can invalidate the service. It violates the principle of transparency and honesty expected of process servers and undermines public trust in the legal system. A third incorrect approach is to engage in aggressive or intimidating behavior during the service attempt, even if the intention is to compel acceptance of the documents. This can lead to accusations of harassment, assault, or trespass, resulting in civil lawsuits against the process server and potential criminal charges. Process servers have a duty to conduct themselves professionally and respectfully, even in challenging circumstances. Professional decision-making in similar situations requires a thorough understanding of the relevant jurisdiction's rules of civil procedure and any specific statutes governing process serving. When faced with ambiguity or a novel situation, a process server should consult with their client or legal counsel to ensure compliance. Prioritizing lawful and ethical conduct over expediency is crucial. A systematic approach involving verification of recipient identity, confirmation of service method legality, and meticulous documentation is essential to mitigate liability. Question 20. The evaluation methodology shows that when attempting to serve a defendant, a process server encounters an individual who presents a state-issued identification card. The server observes that the photograph on the card appears to match the individual, and the name and date of birth are consistent with the information provided for the defendant. However, the expiration date on the card is 2 months past. What is the most appropriate course of action for the process server to ensure proper identification procedures are followed? Option A. Proceed with service, as the photograph and name match and the expiration is recent. Option B. Decline to serve based on the expired identification and attempt to locate the defendant at another time or address. Option C. Request additional forms of identification, such as a utility bill or a credit card, to corroborate the identity. Option D. Accept the expired identification as sufficient, noting the discrepancy in the service affidavit, and proceed with service. The correct answer is A. Proceed with service, as the photograph and name match, and the expiration is recent. Explanation. The evaluation methodology shows that proper identification procedures are a cornerstone of the Advanced Process Server Certification exam, directly impacting the validity of service and the integrity of the legal process. This scenario is professionally challenging because process servers operate in dynamic environments where individuals may present various forms of identification, some of which might be incomplete, expired, or even fraudulent. The server must exercise keen judgment to balance the need for accurate identification with the urgency of effecting service, all while adhering strictly to established legal and ethical standards. Failure to do so can lead to contested service, dismissal of cases, and reputational damage. The correct approach involves a multifaceted verification process that prioritizes official, government-issued identification. This aligns with regulatory frameworks that mandate reasonable diligence in identifying the party being served. Specifically, it requires examining the photograph, name, date of birth, and expiration date on the identification to ensure it matches the individual and is current. If discrepancies arise, or if the presented identification is questionable, the server must employ secondary verification methods, such as cross-referencing with other available information or, if permissible and practical, seeking confirmation from a third party who knows the individual. This thoroughness is ethically mandated to prevent serving the wrong person, which undermines due process and can have severe legal consequences for all parties involved. An incorrect approach that relies solely on a driver's license without verifying its current status or cross-referencing other details is professionally unacceptable. This fails to meet the standard of reasonable diligence required by law, as an expired or suspended license may not accurately represent the individual's current identity or legal standing. Another incorrect approach, which involves accepting a library card or a student ID as sufficient identification, is also flawed. These forms of identification typically lack the security features and official verification of government-issued documents and are not generally considered reliable for legal identification purposes. Accepting such documents risks serving the wrong individual, thereby failing to provide proper legal notice. A third incorrect approach, which involves serving the individual based on their verbal assurance of identity without any form of verifiable documentation, is the most egregious failure. This completely bypasses the established identification protocols, opening the door to widespread fraud and misidentification, and is a direct violation of the duty of care owed to the court and the parties. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic checklist approach to identification. First, always request government-issued photo identification. Second, meticulously examine all key details on the ID: photograph, name, date of birth, and expiration date. Third, if any element is questionable or missing, do not proceed with service based solely on that document. Instead, explore secondary verification methods as permitted by law and ethical guidelines, such as checking other documents or seeking corroboration. If doubt persists and no reliable identification can be obtained, the server should document their efforts and consult with their supervising attorney or the issuing court for guidance, rather than proceeding with a potentially invalid service.